Does anyone remember in the early 2000s when vampires were really popular? I mean, like, the early 2000s, a good few years before Twilight came out. Thinking back on it, it did feel like we were seeing vampire media having a little bit of a resurgence around that time, with films like Blade 2 and Queen of the Damned being pretty popular. So I guess it made sense for video games to want to capitalize on that as well. Heck, Blood Omen 2 was released around that time. Video games have no shortage of vampires for sure, but for the most part, you tend to see them as villains. Heck, even one of my own personal favorite game franchises ever, Castlevania, features the king of all vampires, Dracula, as its main villain. But you don't see too many games that star a vampire as a hero. Sure, they can be a protagonist like Cain, but what about an actual benevolent vampire? In that case, you'd probably end up with someone like Rayne from the BloodRayne series. Well, okay, technically she's only a half vampire, but the point still stands. The BloodRayne series, initially developed by Terminal Reality, began right around the time in the early 2000s when that new millennium vampire media, pre-Twilight, was arguably at its peak. And Rayne herself was something of a gaming icon in her day, sort of an edgier version of Lara Croft, before we actually got an edgier version of Lara Croft. But it seems as though just as quickly as Rayne appeared, she virtually vanished from the public conscious. So I would like to take some time to talk about the games that started her multimedia franchise. I usually cover horror-themed video games around Halloween, and while this isn't strictly horror, I will say it's horror adjacent. Alright, now with all that out of the way, let's go pay our respects to Rayne and her franchise in the franchise graveyard. So, before we go over the first game in the series, who would like a small history lesson on its development? Before we can deep dive into BloodRayne, we first need to take a look at a little-known game called Nocturne. No, not that Nocturne. This Nocturne was Terminal Reality's action horror title released exclusively on Microsoft Windows in 1999. The game contains supernatural horror-styled creatures such as werewolves, zombies, and yes, even vampires. One vampire in particular was this lady, the half-vampire Svetlana. As you can probably already tell, she looks pretty similar to Rayne, and there is a reason for that. After Nocturne had shipped, a sequel entered the planning stages that would have placed Svetlana in a more prominent role, if not just straight up the starring role. However, not too long into development did the game's publisher, the Gathering of Developers, go defunct, leaving Terminal Reality without a publisher. Not wanting to trust another publisher with their series, or their established game canon to another potentially untrustworthy publisher, they decided to take ideas from their previous work in this Nocturne cinematic universe, which also includes the 3 games based on the Blair Witch, and craft an entirely new IP. The Svetlana character would effectively serve as a precursor to a new character, Rayne. In fact, beta screenshots from the cancelled Nocturne 2 seem to look incredibly similar to the game we ended up with. Oh, and this doesn't really tie into BloodRayne, but I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't at least mention it. Terminal Reality owned the trademark to the word Nocturne for use in video games around this time, which is why Atlas credits them in Shin Megami Tensei 3 in the US, and why it has a different subtitle altogether in PAL regions. Alright, with all that out of the way, let's talk about the first game I'm actually here to talk about. BloodRayne was released in 2002 for the PS2, GameCube, Xbox, and Microsoft Windows. It combines hack-and-slash action with a third-person shooter, and also has very light platforming elements. The game opens with our half-vampire hero Rayne receiving an invitation from the Brimstone Society, an underground group of elite special agents dedicated to protecting the world from supernatural threats. Being both half-vampire and an incredibly skilled shooter, they take special interest in Rayne and invite her among their ranks, giving her the codename Agent BloodRayne. Taking place in the years leading up to World War II, BloodRayne is broken into 3 main chapters. The first is an introductory chapter in Louisiana where the newly recruited Rayne and her mentor, Mintz, have to hunt down and eliminate a parasitic infestation, turning the people who live there into mind-controlled slaves called mutates. This chapter will help you get the hang of the controls and the basic game mechanics. Rayne's default melee attack is her arm blades, which can be comboed together if she's hitting an enemy with them. You can gain new abilities with these after beating a boss or by fulfilling certain objectives within the levels. Rayne also gains access to a wide variety of guns, in addition to using her blades. You get the standard pistols, shotguns, rifles, but also explosives and occasionally a rocket launcher. The game plays like a standard third-person shooter from this era, but instead of having a reticle to aim with, Rayne will automatically lock onto the enemies that are closest to her. She can aim in 2 different directions at once if she's armed with a gun for each hand. And while the auto-aim does an alright job of keeping track of the enemies most of the time, I think I personally would have preferred that reticle because I feel like sometimes the bullets don't always hit what I want them to hit with the auto-aim. In addition to the combat, you'll also be introduced to Rayne's special abilities, like her mid-air spin kick to kick down doors and fragile walls, and to help close the gap between enemies and land masses, to her Blood Rage ability, which is gained by killing enough enemies until your rage meter on the lower right is filled, and by tapping a button to release extremely devastating attacks on your enemies that turns them into bloody chunks in a matter of seconds. One of the key gimmicks of the game is feeding on your enemy's blood to replenish your health. There are no health pickups in this game, so it's with this mechanic you take advantage of Rayne's vampire heritage and feast on your enemies like an all-you-can-eat buffet. Depending on how you latch onto enemies, you can also shoot while feeding, but you also have to aim very precisely. It's almost not even worth it. You can also fire your guns while in midair while doing your rebound kick, but it's a complete waste of ammo because you're more than likely not even going to hit anything. When enemies die, they don't respawn, so it's sometimes best to leave an enemy alive in case your health starts to dip later on. I almost forgot to mention this because I never really used it all that often, but Rayne also comes equipped with a harpoon to grab faraway enemies and drag them towards her to feed on. I gotta say, personally speaking, the Louisiana chapter is probably my favorite area in the whole game. Something about fighting weird mutated zombies in a dark, half-flooded swamp. Though I can't say I'm comfortable seeing Rayne feeding off of these things. It's like these things were crawling around in swamp water and probably smell like old damp towels. Just, no. Once you finished off the Parasite Queen in Louisiana, the game's main villain, Jurgen Wolf, appears. He's looking for the scattered body parts of an ancient demon called Beliar, and has employed a secret branch of the Third Reich to do so. We then cut to 5 years later, and the Brimstone Society has closed in on his location, a naval base in Argentina. It's here the game's second chapter, the longest in the game, begins. And it's also here we say goodbye to the mutates as we fight our next major enemy type, Nazis. No, not those guys, real Nazis. We're also given the task of hunting down a secret branch of the Third Reich called the Gegengeist Group. Gegengeist Group? Led by the aforementioned Jurgen Wolf, who are attempting to find the remaining artifacts of Beliar. It's also around here the game starts to get a touch creepier with the introduction of a new demonic parasitic enemy, the Damites.
I'll wear you like lederhosen.
And you ruined it. Your general mission in this part of the game is to go around the compound and take out the high-ranking members, who effectively serve as mini-bosses. It's also here that the game introduces enemies that are armored and therefore impervious to your arm blades, so firearms are generally the way to go here. You'll find guns, but when you run out of ammo for them, Rayne will automatically toss them. Despite looking big at first glance, this compound actually isn't all that confusing to navigate, as you do get a radar giving you a rough idea of where your next objectives are. And for the most part, you're going to be doing a lot of shooting. In fact, you're going to be doing almost exclusively shooting. This can get a bit repetitive during long play sessions, but the areas are generally short and compact enough to where it feels like you're making decent progress quickly. I won't lie, the game overall definitely has that unmistakable early 2000s jank, but I also never really ran into any major game-breaking glitches or bugs. The game overall has a pretty fair difficulty, at least in this segment in Argentina. Once you've taken out all your targets in the Argentina base, the game then shifts to its third and final segment, a castle in Germany, where the remaining members of the Gegengeist group have escaped. It's here we're introduced to two things: a new enemy type in the form of evolved vampires, and a major difficulty spike. Exploring this castle is much more of a challenge than the relatively straightforward compound of the Argentina chapter. Just trying to find your next target or your next objective can get rather frustrating in this large, confusing layout. I recall spending upwards of an hour just trying to figure out what to do next in my first playthrough. In fact, this part of the game also showed me how unforgiving the game's checkpoint system can get. Up till this point, I was having a pretty comfortable playthrough. I wasn't dying too much. But this last segment of the game really throws tougher enemies at you, in addition to the more spread out objectives. Each of the 3 main chapters are split into several levels, and when you die, you start from the beginning of that level, regardless of how much progress you made up to that point. So if you beat a boss but were low on health, and got killed by a stray bullet or a bottomless pit or something, then you're starting that whole level again and fighting that boss all over again. Also, this last chapter introduces bottomless pits, which were, up till now, absent from the game. The second to last level in the game right before the final boss was by far the hardest level in the game, which, yeah, makes sense, but it was definitely frustrating. It involves trying to avoid mines in a minefield, then going up against tough enemies, including a mech that's shooting at you, and then crossing an exploding bridge over a bottomless pit. Die at any point before reaching that fortress, and guess what? You're starting that whole level over again. Granted, it's not a very long level, but getting close to the end only to have the bridge fall out from beneath you after crossing a minefield and getting away from a big group of enemies and a mech all shooting at you is a recipe for an aneurysm. Oh, I forgot to mention, you get to pilot a mech in one level. All you do in it is walk around slowly and shoot other identical mechs until the level says you can stop. It's pretty mindless, but controlling this with a keyboard tripped me up a couple of times. Now, I've prattled on about how the game plays, so allow me to focus a bit on the game's presentation. From a visual standpoint, the game is honestly pretty standard for a multi-platform release in 2002. I'm playing with a bit of an advantage because I'm playing this on PC, but the texture work is pretty decent for its time. I do find it kind of funny how the characters' mouth movements will match the dialogue for the most part, but their eyes look like they've been painted on a mannequin. Their eyes and faces don't animate that much, but for a game from this time period that wasn't exactly a AAA release, you can't really be that hard on it. Rayne is voiced by Laura Bailey, who you probably know nowadays as the voice of Lust from Full Metal Alchemist, Catherine from, well, Catherine, Rise from Persona 4, Abby from The Last of Us Part 2, and Black Widow from last year's Avengers game, among others. And while I do think she was an excellent casting choice here, I don't feel like they gave her the best direction here.
Well, when I'm done, you'll both be missing more than an arm.
She kind of sounds a bit bored for a lot of her lines, though maybe I'm mistaken and that was the kind of character she was meant to portray.
Easy with that thing. And who'd you call ugly?
I think that's about all I have to say about BloodRayne. While it is pretty rough around the edges, even for its time, its combination of action, horror, and a sexy female lead all helped make it a standout title for 2002. While the game received mediocre to decent critical review scores, it sold well enough for publisher Majesco to greenlight a sequel. BloodRayne I sold over 500,000 copies across all 4 platforms, which, for a multi-platform game without an insane development budget, was considered a major success by its publisher, Majesco. And so, roughly 2 years later in 2004, Majesco and Terminal Reality released the sequel, appropriately titled BloodRayne 2! Sorry. BloodRayne 2 sought to improve and expand on many of the concepts of the original game, namely the combat and the exploration. It also sought to make the series even sexier than it already was. And while the game does do a small part in that regard, Majesco's marketing team was decidedly far less subtle about it. One look at their magazine ad says it all. Hell, they even went so far as to have Rayne pose topless in the October 2004 issue of Playboy, making her the first video game character to ever do so. Whew, boy, good luck getting away with that today. Also, is it just me, or does Rayne really look a hell of a lot like Mila Jovovich in this game? I know the Resident Evil movies were pretty popular around this time, but I have no idea if this was intentional or not. BloodRayne 2 was released in 2004 for the PS2, Xbox, and Windows. No GameCube version this time around because this was around the time that third-party publishers realized that the GameCube is where the third-party games go to die. The sequel takes place 66 years after the events of the first game. But in that time, Rayne hasn't aged a day thanks to her vampire genetics. In the time between games, Rayne's been hunting down and slaughtering the offspring of Kagan, the vampire half of Rayne's half-vampirism, and she's nearly finished taking them all out. These vampire half-siblings have formed what is known as the Cult of Kagan, and the remaining members have constructed a doomsday weapon known as the Shroud, which, when activated, will darken the skies, allowing vampires to run free at any time of day. This lines up quite well with Rayne's personal vendetta, so she sets off to take out Kagan and her remaining half-siblings. In her quest, she's joined by series newcomer Severin, voiced by Troy Baker. As in, pre-Last of Us, pre-Bioshock Infinite Troy Baker. So yeah, those of you who only know him for his VO work today, nah, he's been doing this for a while. Right out of the gate, the first thing you're sure to notice is that the game takes place in a more contemporary, early to mid-2000s American setting. Vampires and other supernatural scaries still exist in this world, but now you'll be going up against them in the era of neon lights and modern-day goth fashion. And it all comes to life thanks to the new visual upgrade the sequel has received. The new physics means that enemies now ragdoll when you get them on the ground or throw them across levels. More on that later. Again, I have a bit of an advantage since I am playing this on PC, but the game's visuals and animations have seen an improvement, without a doubt. Heck, even the voice acting has seen an improvement. Rayne, once again voiced by Laura Bailey, actually emotes and sounds like she gives a damn about what's going on. Heck, she even cracks genuinely funny jokes occasionally.
Now, do you see a way to get to the upper level?
I have bowel in my hair.
Rayne?
The only nitpick I have is with some of the pre-rendered cutscenes. And I don't mean the ones that run in real time, those look pretty good. I mean that for some of them, they use full CG, but then you have these where I don't know if they're using in-game models for them, but they don't look nearly as good. In fact, I think they actually look kind of worse than the cutscenes that run in real time. Or at least the character models do, anyway. The combat system, particularly the melee, has seen a total overhaul. Not only do you have access to Rayne's arm blades again, but now there's a dedicated kick button, which is primarily used for disarming enemies with melee weapons. And these can also be chained together to perform combos. Compared to the first game, the melee actually feels genuinely fun to use, for the most part. Admittedly though, it does start to feel a bit clunky when doing it for extended periods of time. You have to rely a lot on dodging, and trying to get around enemy defenses, and even then, it can feel like your attacks sometimes miss. Definitely don't go into this expecting Devil May Cry or Bayonetta, because this definitely ain't it. BloodRayne 2 plays more like a standard third-person action-adventure game than it does an early 2000s third-person shooter. Meaning, while there's no strafing like there was in the first game, or at least not unless you're locked onto an enemy, and your view is no longer strictly stuck behind Rayne, you now have full 360-degree movement with the left stick, and of the camera as well. It can be great for getting good angles and getting a good look around, but it can feel like the camera has a little bit of a mind of its own at times, usually during really intense enemy encounters. That's not to say BloodRayne 2 doesn't still have shooting in it, though. While you can no longer pick up guns from killed enemies, you do get a hold of a special pair of guns early on called the Carpathian Dragons. These special weapons use blood as its ammo, meaning you can drain blood from your enemies to use as ammo. So blood is used in this game not only as health, but also as ammo for your guns. Well, gun. Despite it only being technically one gun, you gradually unlock new fire modes for it, effectively making it a kind of multi-gun. Your first mode is a pistol-style single shot, then you unlock the equivalent of a submachine gun, a shotgun, a grenade launcher, and even a missile launcher. Though, you can't go too crazy using these guns. Remember what I said about them using blood as ammo? Well, when the blood in the chambers run out, it starts draining your health every time you fire them. Though you can refill them by pressing a button while you're feeding on an enemy, they can only give you a set amount of blood at a time before they die. So there's gonna come times where you'll need to choose between refilling your health or your ammo when facing an enemy. Rayne's vampire powers also see her return, such as her blood rage power and her aura vision to help you find your objectives and environmental objects you can climb and jump onto. She'll also receive new ones like super speed, the ability to freeze time, and the ability to create a ghostly version of herself to feed on nearby enemies, which is very helpful. If you're playing the game with a controller, these powers are mapped to the D-pad, and many of them are accessed by pressing a certain direction on it twice. Many of these powers use her blue rage meter, which can be replenished by killing or performing fatality moves on enemies, which is done by pressing either attack button while feeding. It's almost worth it just to see the creative ways Rayne dismembers enemies. Rage points aren't the only thing that can be gained by taking out enemies, though. You now have something akin to an experience point system. When the blades on your health and rage meters reach all the way to the end, you'll gain a permanent increase to both. You can also level up your guns by using them, increasing their ammo capacity up to 3 times. So combat's received a bit of an overhaul, but how does the level exploration fare compared to the first game? As I mentioned earlier, the game plays more like your typical third-person action-adventure game than a third-person shooter. And as such, not only does the game give you more control over the camera, but platforming and even your own traversal skill set are handled a bit differently too. Rayne can no longer do her little spinny rebound kick, nor can she jump as ridiculously high as she did in the first game, but the sequel does give you a double jump. It sounds helpful, but it isn't always. For example, there have been times where the game just wouldn't let me reach a platform or a higher ledge. The platforming isn't always that graceful, and honestly, it's pretty clunky. I see and can respect what they were going for, but it isn't executed the best in my opinion. BloodRayne 2 also introduces a pole climbing and pole swinging mechanic, and because of the way that's handled, I've felt my blood run cold every time I see one of these segments. You change direction on a swinging pole by pressing left or right on the left stick, and jumping toward another pole or ledge is done by pressing up on the left stick, no matter where the camera is centered. And when climbing a pole, you only need to turn your back towards where you want to jump and then press the jump button. Hopefully I've explained this in the least confusing manner possible, but there's a very specific way the game wants you to correctly make these jumps to and from climbable objects. It can be a bit tricky if you don't follow the instructions in the first level carefully. I may have forgotten all about Rayne's harpoon chain thing in the first game, but BloodRayne 2 refuses to let you forget about it this time. Instead of using it just to bring enemies close to you, you can also use it to fling enemies around like ragdolls. While it can be satisfying to see your enemies get flung into walls, breakable objects, and even each other if you position it just right, the game seems to have a real fetish with a certain kind of puzzle involving this mechanic. I think some of you who have played BloodRayne 2 may have been waiting for me to bring this up. Well, now's the time. While this game isn't exactly puzzle-heavy, there is one kind of... It's not really a puzzle per se, it's really more like an obstacle. You'll run into these mandatory sections where you'll have to use your harpoon to throw enemies into things like fan blades, furnaces, turbines, basically anything to cause damage to your environment and progress onwards. Somebody at Terminal Reality must have really loved this idea, because you're going to be throwing enemies into things a lot in this game. And while these are definitely fun in their own gruesome way the first 2 or 3 times you do them, after a while, they just overstay their welcome. At one point, I found 3 of these sections during a 20-minute recording section. 3 within minutes of each other. There's even a moment where you have to trick a large enemy into smashing open the casings to electrify generators so you can throw enemies into them and destroy a machine to progress. This part was frustrating, and I died a lot. Hell, I even ran into a glitch where I got stuck in one of the generators. Luckily, I didn't have to redo the whole level all over again. Someone at Terminal Reality must have gotten the memo that people like it when games give you mid-level checkpoints, because I didn't have that kind of issue with that here. Granted, you can't restart from your last checkpoint like you can in games today, so if you do choose to restart something, you have to either restart the whole level or wait for something to kill you. While BloodRayne 2 is considerably more polished than its predecessor in a lot of key areas, there are still a few small areas here and there where that mid-2000s jank sneaks through. It's really more in the controls and the camera that the jank seems to sneak in. The jumps feel awkward and floaty, and the camera tends to be uncooperative as well, as was usually the case for a game from a time when developers were still kinda trying to figure out 3D cameras. When the game isn't throwing those throw the enemy into a death trap sections at you, sometimes it'll make you fight a mini-boss. These can be intense in a good way when you're properly equipped to handle them, but there will be those times where you have like half of your health left and no rage points, and the game will block you from progress until you take out this mini-boss. The game does try to remedy this by throwing an endless supply of regular grunts at you so you can drain their blood to refill your health or your ammo, but this isn't always the case. And as a result, you'll just have to go with what you got. And since the only way to replenish your health is by feeding, then you'd better hope they spawn in a few easy enemies without melee weapons so you can get your health back easily, as enemies with melee weapons can knock you off if you try to feed on them from the front. And even then, enemies can still attack you while you're feeding, so you kinda have to turn away from their attacks or their gunfire when doing so. BloodRayne 2 definitely shows an honest effort to improve and expand upon the original title, and in a few cases, it definitely does. The presentation and production value are definitely a step up over the original, and an honest effort clearly went into overhauling the gameplay. What I feel holds the game back from being an immense improvement over the first game is that the gameplay loop can get pretty repetitive, the controls at times floaty and awkward, and the camera at times uncooperative. BloodRayne 2 reviewed about as well as the first game, but in my research I couldn't find any sales numbers. It's possible that the sequel didn't sell very well, as we wouldn't see another game in the series for another 7 years. Though that didn't necessarily mean we wouldn't see Rayne herself again, as the very next year in 2005, Rayne would get her very own honest-to-God movie. As in, released in theaters and had notable Hollywood talent movie. I'm sure a few of you watching this were waiting for me to talk about these, but the BloodRayne series would ultimately end up getting not 1, not 2, but 3 movies, the first of which released in theaters. And all 3 directed by Uwe Boll, who at the time was infamous for his less than well-received film adaptations of other video game franchises. The overwhelmingly negative reception of the films, both from critics and from fans of the series, probably damaged the brand name, and that may have been another reason why we didn't see another game for 7 years. And I'm sure this part of the retrospective is going to disappoint a fair amount of you, but I won't be going into the films here. Simply because I've never seen them. And frankly, I kind of just want to focus on the games for this video. And maybe a little bit out of fear for copyright strikes. It's already been said by so many others at this point, but all 3 films were critical disasters. What I always found funny was that for a time, there were more movies based on a game series than there were games. At least until 1 year after the release of the 3rd film. During this 7-year period, the BloodRayne series went quiet, though Terminal Reality would stay busy making licensed games, such as the one based on the 2005 live-action Aeon Flux movie, the one Ghostbusters game that was supposedly really good, and Connect Star Wars. Yeah, that one. I'm surprised this didn't kill Star Wars. It should have. But I digress. Oh, and I don't know when I'm ever going to bring this up again, but do you remember that movie Grandma's Boy, where that one guy was making a game called Demonic? Well, not only was that at one point in time going to be a real game you could buy in stores and play, but that was also made by Terminal Reality before it was ultimately canceled. In 2010, there was talk of a Nintendo 3DS title called BloodRayne: The Shroud, but considering the 3DS came and went without the game's release, I think it's pretty safe to say that it's been canceled. Very little is known about it other than its title. Not so much as a single member of the original development team behind it has come forward and claimed it. But this wouldn't be the only BloodRayne title announced around that time, as we still have one more game to look at. The 2011 download-only title, BloodRayne Betrayal. Terminal Reality would not be responsible for this one, but rather Way Forward, oddly enough, who you probably know for the Shantae and Mighty Switch Force games, among others. If you couldn't tell by looking at it, BloodRayne Betrayal is a side-scrolling hack-and-slasher with some platforming elements. You know, it's funny, we've gone from a third-person shooter to a third-person action-adventure game to a 2D side-scroller. One thing I'm sure you've noticed by now is the more comic book-esque art style. Mileage is definitely going to vary on this one, and while I will admit it isn't my preferred art style for the BloodRayne series, I will admit it does look nice and it animates quite nicely. For the most part. Some of it kind of looks like a Newgrounds Flash game. I mean, just check out this ketchup monster. And this close-up of Rayne kind of looks like it comes from something fan-made. I don't think the budget on this one was that high either. The level backgrounds look very nice, even if you're only going through the same 3 or 4 types of locations, but then again, that's kind of been the case for the other 2 games, hasn't it? The game is structured as such. There are 15 levels, and your goal is simply to get to the end, all the while slicing up any enemy that gets in your way and solving the occasional puzzle and navigating the occasional platforming challenge. It kind of sounds like I'm breezing through the description of the game here, but honestly, this is basically the whole game in a nutshell. Betrayal doesn't do anything that innovative with the formula, but considering it's only a $10 download game instead of a $50 console game from the early to mid-aughts, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. It might be disappointing to some that there wasn't a true BloodRayne 3, but I could see this being a good supplementary game to help bridge the gap between main installments. More on that later. The gameplay that you'd expect from the series does translate well into 2D for the most part. Rayne's slash attacks will be your primary method of combat, similar to how it was in BloodRayne 2, and she even has some aerial combos she can pull off this time around. As expected from hack-and-slash action games, there will be multiple parts and levels where you'll have to take out all of the enemies before you can progress. You only get 2 guns this time around, a Magnum and, later, a laser cannon. If you line up the Magnum just right, you can hit a whole bunch of enemies with it at once. You only have 5 shots with it when you start, but you can upgrade this by collecting 5 red skulls that are scattered around levels. You can also upgrade your maximum health with this, so when you get 5 red skulls, you'll be given a choice as to which one you want to upgrade. The laser cannon can ignite certain enemies, which in turn causes them to destroy certain obstacles. It's also used for powering on certain switches. You don't have full 360-degree aim with it, so there will be those times where you'll have to reposition yourself to hit a certain thing. One new power Rayne is given in this game is the ability to infect enemies. Hitting an enemy and then immediately following it by pressing the B button or the circle button causes her to feed, which, you guessed it, heals her. However, if you press the button instead of holding it, Rayne will bite the enemy and cause them to turn green. Pressing Y or triangle will detonate the enemies, which can be used to damage groups of enemies or destroy certain breakable walls. You know, it was kind of funny because I kept pressing the button not knowing what it did, and the game didn't tell me what it did until several levels in. And while the combat can be a lot of fun in its own right, I can't help but feel that the game has a bit of a bad habit of dropping some of my inputs, rendering me unable to, say, jump or dash immediately after attacking. For a game that really encourages twitch reflexes, why does it feel like I can't string another action so quickly after attacking? It leaves you wide open for counterattack too often. So you're probably asking, what does dropped inputs mean? Well, say you're playing a game and, for example, you try to jump from one platform to the next, and even though you know full well you pressed the jump button, the game will act like you didn't and will send you careening off the platform to your doom. Well, Betrayal has a habit of doing that kind of thing not only with the combat, but also the platforming. This is a complaint I often see come up in user reviews, and yeah, they definitely don't lie. Yeah, that's right, combat won't be the only thing this game will have you doing, as more than any other title before it, Betrayal places a large emphasis on platforming. And I'm not gonna lie, when you aren't getting cucked by the sticky controls or the occasional dickish saw blade placement, some of these are actually pretty alright in my opinion. They test your reflexes and sometimes your brain, and I actually got a lot of satisfaction out of completing these. Hell, I even liked these little Flappy Bird sections. Yeah, they control almost exactly like Flappy Bird, but you know what? Screw it, these were fun too. And while these segments can be occasionally frustrating in their own way, and most of my deaths came from these way more than the boss fights and stuff, I still found these platforming segments to be pretty enjoyable. I had heard horror stories of how hard and unfair this game was, and while there are definitely some frustrating moments, I didn't find it to be that bad. Maybe Jim Sterling just sucks at video games. Though I will concede that trying to get anything higher than an F ranking in levels does require a level of skill and patience that I clearly don't have. One thing I also wasn't expecting to like as much as I did was the music. The previous two games use a very atmospheric, but still very fitting, soundtrack that works well for what it does, but they aren't exactly tracks that you'll be playing on your drive to work. Betrayal, on the other hand, has a shockingly amazing soundtrack that I find can be listened to by itself without gameplay accompaniment. I've heard amazing things about Way Forward composer Jake Kaufman, and with a soundtrack like this one, I can definitely see why. Frankly, I was kinda getting Castlevania vibes off of this soundtrack. Have you noticed I haven't brought up the story at all? Well, the reason for it is actually why I'm hesitant to refer to this game officially as BloodRayne 3, despite all the game's marketing material constantly saying this is, quote, Rayne's last job. So you know how Kagan was the main villain in BloodRayne 2? Well, guess who the main villain in this game is? Give up? It's Kagan again. I get the feeling that Betrayal is trying to sell itself as the next official continuation of the series, and if it's really trying to, why bring back Kagan as the main villain? I'm spoiling a bit here, but Kagan is very dead at the end of BloodRayne 2. Yeah, spoiler, the villain dies at the end. And this game makes no reference to him being resurrected. They could literally have called this villain any other name and it would have worked. But now we've got this continuity error if this is supposed to be BloodRayne 3. But if you take this game as just a little non-canon offshoot game, it's fine. I know this section on Betrayal is much shorter than the rest of the video, but this is a $10 side-scrolling download game. It's not as substantial as the other two. It's also a pretty short game too. You can beat it in about 2 to 3 hours. There's not even any voice acting in this game aside from a few grunts and shouts. Laura Bailey and Troy Baker don't even reprise their original roles here. Then again, by 2011, they were already making enormous strides as actors, so Way Forward probably couldn't afford them. Overall though, I gotta say, I was actually pleasantly surprised with this one. It's certainly not perfect, the controls could have used some more tweaking, but for what it is, it ain't bad. Like with BloodRayne 2, I couldn't find sales numbers on Betrayal. But from the looks of it, they weren't good. The lukewarm critical reception of it was more than likely what did it in. In fact, remember that game BloodRayne: The Shroud I talked about earlier? Apparently this and Betrayal were supposedly in development at or around the same time, but allegedly due to Betrayal's poor sales numbers, The Shroud would be cancelled by publisher Majesco. As for Terminal Reality, in 2013 they shipped The Walking Dead: Survival Instinct. That game was a critical and commercial disaster, so much of a blatantly unfinished glitch fest that it got utterly obliterated by critics, and players weren't much kinder to it. In fact, that game sold so badly that later that same year, Terminal Reality closed its doors. BloodRayne's publisher Majesco didn't appear keen to greenlight any future projects for the series either. And with that, that was the end of both Terminal Reality and the BloodRayne series. That is, until the year 2020, when a new challenger appeared. Enter Ziggurat Interactive. In the summer of 2020, Ziggurat purchased several of Majesco's IPs, and sure enough, one of those IPs just so happened to be BloodRayne. And their first order of business for the series would be get key members of Terminal Reality back together to create a high-definition remaster of the first two games, subtitled The Terminal Cut, both of which launched in November of that year. In fact, you know how I've been saying that I've been playing the PC version? Well, the footage that you've been seeing in this video is actually from the Terminal Cut versions. And best of all, if you already owned the original release of either two games, Ziggurat were kind enough to give you the Terminal Cut version for free on launch day. And lucky me, I just so happened to already own the first two games. And just as I was putting the finishing touches on this retrospective, Ziggurat and WayForward also released an updated version of Betrayal, which brought back Laura Bailey and Troy Baker as Rayne and Kagan respectively, and also a new rebalanced difficulty setting. But Ziggurat doesn't plan on stopping there. When acquiring the IP, they have stated that they have plans on continuing the series.
Well then, as far as I'm concerned, I'm still on the clock.
Only time will tell what will result of that, but hopefully this means we'll get to see more Rayne, and that we won't have to lay the series to rest again anytime soon. Thanks for watching.